Martinson Talks Books. My guest's late husband wrote one of the great books about theater called Act One, Ma's Heart. But she has written a book called Kitty, an Autobiography. It's published by Doubleday, and I can only tell you it's a life in 3 acts and is more dramatic and glamorous and romantic than most novels on the bestseller list. And we'll be back after a short pause with my guest, Kitty Carlisle Hart. Welcome back. We're talking with Kitty Carlisle Hart, author of Kitty, an Autobiography, published by Doubleday. Welcome, Kitty.
Thank you. What a marvelous introduction.
But how true, how true, because this book, each segment, the first being Mother, could be a novel in itself if it weren't true. This outstanding woman who in many ways, I kept saying, it's a class act version of Rose in Gypsy.
Yes, you know, I thought about that when it was finished, and I thought, I would like to see it made into a musical. It's kind of a high-class Gypsy, exactly what I thought, with sort of operetta music and some popular songs. And it would be one, and I want to play my mother.
Okay, I give you the part. And in which case, let's tell our friends about Hortense, who would say, your mind is a house, furnish it, and takes the little half-orphan Kitty, or Catherine at that point, to Europe to sort of expose her to the world out of New Orleans, and I think a little bit for herself.
Well, actually, I finally realized when I'd finished writing the book that all of my mother's ambition was really for me, because when I went on the stage and she didn't need to play the social game anymore, she dropped it, because really it was all just to get me into society, to make what she called that brilliant marriage, which was well above my station.
Oh, but I love the way she knew to go to the best hotels, but got the cheapest rooms up on the 5th floor.
That's right, under the eaves. I had more maids and valets rooms without a bath.
Yeah.
And I learned to order 1 breakfast for 2 very early on.
And she meets Uncle Ed, and the romance in that part, Kitty, sets it up almost that you can believe in, well, love, romance, and what you finally find later with Moss.
That's right. Well, Mother found this charming man who really fell madly in love with her, and she never would marry him. When I was growing up, it was an embarrassment to me. You know, I had nothing to call him. What was he? He wasn't my stepfather. He wasn't my lawyer. Well, he was my lawyer, but I couldn't very well call him that. And I'd say to my mother, why don't you marry Uncle Ed? I called him Uncle Ed.
Ed Outerbridge?
Ed Otterberg.
Otterberg.
And she'd say, every woman should be married once, and once is enough. Or she'd say, he wouldn't send me flowers twice a week if I married him. Or then finally one day she told me the truth. She said, I don't want to keep house for anyone anymore. She lived in a hotel. And she said, I really want to be able to go to my room and close the door when I want to be alone.
I think a lot of women echo that statement, Kitty. But there was a part, too, where I felt it may have been she recognized those black moods that she had.
That's right.
The anger, the sort of woman who could lock you out of a hotel room. And, you know, that's a pretty strong story.
It was awful, because, you see, there was nobody in Europe that I knew except my mother. We had no lawyer, no doctor, no grandmother, no cousins. And when Mother would lock me out of the hotel room, it was outer darkness. And I would go and sit on the back stairs and wait until she would see fit to forgive me for whatever transgression I'd committed.
Okay, but the drama of the little Kitty putting flowers outside that door, sticking a note under, and only when you saw the flowers taken in did you know she would let you back in again.
That's right.
That's fairly strong.
It was difficult, and I must tell you that there was a tiny core of resentment within me. And when I finished the book, it was a complete catharsis, because I was forced to think about my mother from her point of view, and I realized how difficult life must have been for her.
Yeah.
And so all the resentment is gone, and I'm free to love her as she was.
And the good part was this is a woman who wanted the best for you as she knew it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in her time. You know, she was a person of her time. In her day, Americans were flinging themselves into the sea like lemmings in an effort to get to Paris. There was a joke that went the rounds in those days. Lady says to her husband, if one of us dies, I'm going to Paris.
Yeah. And she was smart enough to get into the stock market, too.
Yes, but she loved playing the market. She had a beau before Uncle Ed who put her into the stock market. And she was doing rather well, like everybody else was, until 1929, when I was the one who always had to ask for the stock market quotations because she didn't speak very good French. You know, when you're very extroverted, you don't speak very good French. And so she talked a lot, but she didn't listen much. So I would ask for the stock market quotations, and one day I just repeated them to a parrot-like, and she fell in a faint on the bed. I thought she was dead.
Yeah.
And finally she opened her eyes and she said, "We've lost what little money we had." And I said, didn't mean very much to me, but she was a woman of lightning decisions. We lived in a charming little house off the Avenue Foch, which was very chic in those days.
Still is?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the next day we were back to the Plaza Athénée in a room under the eaves that was so small we couldn't get past the trunk. And then she said to me, "Well," she said, "it's obvious you're not going to make a brilliant marriage." I'd had 2 cracks at it and I was 19 years old.
Yeah. Oh, the Bolivian and...
London and Paris.
Yes.
And she said, "You're not the prettiest girl I ever saw. You're not the best singer I ever heard. And you're certainly not the best actress I ever hope to see. But if we put them all together, we'll find the husband we're looking for on the stage." And I'd never said no to my mother. Yeah. And I'd never thought of going on the stage.
There is a wonderful letter of advice or book of advice that Uncle Ed writes to you, and you quote in here, and I thought, hey, that's still applicable today.
Every word. Yeah. Absolutely every word. He called it a Baedeker to stardom.
Yeah.
And he took great pains with it. And I read it over when I was doing the book, and I thought, I wish I'd followed his advice more carefully.
But it was Louis K. Sidney, L.K. Sidney,
That's
George
right.
Sidney's father.
That's right.
Who helps you onto the stage in New York.
Well, he gave me my first job in New York. And it was
Rio
a
Rita.
condensed version of Rio Rita. We opened one fine morning at the Capitol Theater along with a movie. And we toured the country doing 4 and 5 shows a day. And eventually we got back to New York. And and I wrote to Mr. Sidney. I got very tired by the time we got to Omaha, I think. And I sent him a telegram saying, "I'm very tired and I'd like to get out of the show." And he wired back, he said, "Stick with it, kid. From what I hear, when you get home, you'll be able to fill Yankee Stadium."
And Kitty, that brings you to Hollywood, films with Bing Crosby, but it also, for those who think that life is all going up, you don't hit that success here. You do go back to New York and...
Paid off, humiliated, and feeling that my life was over at the age of 23.
Yeah. And Kitty, we're going to take a short pause, and we'll be back with our guest, Kitty Carlisle Hart, author of Kitty, an Autobiography, published by Doubleday. Welcome back. We're talking with Kitty Carlisle Hart, author of Kitty, an Autobiography, published by Doubleday. Kitty's second act of the book is Moss Hart. Moss Hart, the eligible Moss Hart, You Can't Take It With You, Light Up the Sky, which of course comes later.
The Man Who Came to Dinner.
The Man Who Came to Dinner, and we said about Alex Wolcott. You meet him and you don't see him for 10 years.
Well, no, we saw each other. That was the worst part. I met him on the set of A Night at the Opera, which I made with the Marx Brothers. And he'd come out there with Cole Porter to look for a leading lady. George Kaufman told me that they were there to see a leading lady, and I got so excited at meeting my 2 heroes. I started to run, and I fell flat at Morse's feet. Yeah. And I kept falling down. I fell down a whole flight of stairs at 21 once. George and Morse were at the foot of the stairs getting their coats. I didn't sleep all night. I thought maybe they might have thought I was drunk. No, all those years, he would ask me to do something once in a while, like be in the national company of The Man Who Came to Dinner, or replace Gertrude Lawrence for the summer, and we never got together.
You never really saw each other until the night at Lillian Hellman's.
That's right.
But you have a great quote in here that I loved, which is, "Women fall in love with their ears."
Yeah, men fall in love with their eyes.
Yeah.
I never heard a woman say, "I saw a man across a crowded room and decided I was going to marry him." I hear this all the time from men. They see a woman across a crowded room and say, "That's woman I'm going to have for my wife." Yeah. And women are seduced by what they hear. Yeah. A man has to talk to a woman and seduce her by what he says, make love to her with his voice and so forth. And Morse seduced me with what he could say. He was so marvelous. He was such a great talker.
And you have this wonderful little wedding that's supposed to be little, and it turns out that the Prince of Theater is marrying, well, the princess.
Well, not quite, but anyway, they got wind of it, and everybody came, and there were a lot of photographers and so forth. And Morse knew my mother better than I did, because when we were talking about how we were going to be married, I said to him, my mother will want a big wedding. I'm her only child. I've never been married. Yeah. And he said, I don't want to do that. He said, we'd have to stand there and shake hands with 1,000 people. He said, why don't you go to the phone and ask her? So I went and I said, Mommy, Morse wants to get married here in New Hope with the Justice of the Peace. And what would that mean? We'd leave his house, go back to the Justice of the Peace, back to his house. What is that? She said, well, you could ride around the block. Yeah. And so he knew her better than I did.
Yeah. Well, neither one of you were kids when you got married.
No, that was it. We'd both been unhappy in different ways.
Yeah.
And we were so grateful to have found each other.
But you had a very colorful time, Kitty. I don't want anyone to think that it was just singing Student Prince.
No, and that I was sort of a wallflower.
I love the story with Bernard Baruch. Two of them. One is when you ask him to give you some financial advice. And, you know, to ask him, it's be today like asking Arm & Hammer.
That's right.
And comes back, work hard, Kitty.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
And the other was the chase around
the bed.
Yeah.
Well, he'd invited me to come to shoot in Scotland. And one night he said he had a bad cold and he wanted to read. He was writing his autobiography. Mm-hmm. Would I come to his room and listen to him read some of the work? Yeah. And so I did, and he leapt out of bed in his long winter underwear and chased me around the bed. And all I could think of was, I've got to get this old gentleman back to bed. He'll catch his death of cold. Yeah.
And Kitty, in the marriage with Moss, great success, but in the beginning, not such great success. But there is the scene with Alan J. Lerner, and the fact that Moss could have demanded maybe co-writing credit on My Fair Lady,
yes.
And then even with Camelot.
That's right.
And you don't get it.
No, because I said to him, you know, why don't you ask for this? Because at that point, somebody like Kazan was getting a very large piece of the show. This was new, however. And Morse said, no, you hire a writer-director, and he writes and directs.
Yeah.
But I must say that Alan and Fritz were very kind to me, because after Morse died, they were very fond of him and grateful to him for the work he had done. And they gave me a tiny percentage of the first-class rights to both plays.
And there is a play that I love called Light Up the Sky.
Yes.
That takes place in Boston at the Ritz-Carlton
That's
Hotel.
Right. Yes.
And I remember seeing that play.
Yes. And it was
Sam Levine.
Sam. It was the first night of an opening night in Boston, and it was all about what happens to a cast when they feel that they failed. Yeah. It was a kind of microcosm of the world, really, how people behave in success and failure. Yeah. And I played in it a lot with Sam.
Kitty, you're very honest in this book about Moss's psychoanalysis,
yes.
The terrible headache, depressions, the black sort
umbrella.
Of depths that he would go into, and the doctor not wanting to give him anything to sort of chemically help him out of it. Talk a little bit about what it was like to live with that.
Well, the depressions were very difficult, and mostly difficult for him. I could see that terrible sadness come and veil those beautiful brown eyes. And we would walk and talk. You know, we had a house here on the beach. We rented Norma Shearer's house one summer. And we'd walk and we'd talk, and I'd try to talk him and help him out of it. And then I would throw up my hands and say, you must go back to the analyst. He said that he went to psychoanalysis so early on that the Indians were still shooting arrows from behind the trees on Fifth Avenue. But he never took it out on the family. He always tried to keep some facade of normal life. He said, you don't escape from life, you escape into it.
I love that. I had
which
that
is
quote,
very sensible.
Yes.
And so he would keep going out. He said, you must attach yourself to reality. But it was hard, and it was hard on him. And the downward thing was so fast. He would go into these depressions so quickly in a matter of a week, and then it would take months to work his way up.
In living with that, did you ever talk to the analyst or talk to any other medical advisor?
No, that was verboten.
Yeah,
in
I
those
forgot
days,
those days, yeah.
You don't talk to the guy's analyst.
Yeah, even if he writes some of the better known books.
That's right. And I felt as though I was like Psyche and Cupid. if I asked his name, or Elsa von Brabant in Lohengrin, he
Yeah.
would take the swan boat and disappear forever.
Yeah.
So I never asked any questions. But I suffered with him, of course I did. I always felt, now that I look back, I think that Morse was slightly a manic depressive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are drugs today
Yeah,
to help
lithium,
those people,
yeah.
lithium and so forth. And if we'd known a little more then, I think he could have been helped.
Yeah.
But I will say that the highs, although he was never out of control,
Yeah.
but he was absolutely, he couldn't be brooked. He could do anything he wanted when he was in one of those
Yeah.
highs. That's when he decided that he was going to do black and white in the Ascot scene in My Fair Lady. And Alan and Fritz said they never heard of a black and white costume in a musical. But Morse was able to bullet through because he was on one of those highs.
Yeah.
And it was a memorable scene.
Yeah, the price of genius.
Yeah.
Kitty, we're going to take a short pause, and we'll be back with our guest, Kitty Carlisle Hart, author of Kitty, a Biography. Welcome back. We're talking with Kitty Carlisle Hart, author of Kitty, an autobiography published by Doubleday. Third act, it begins with Moss's heart attack. You go to Palm Springs, the children. Your daughter is the same age you were almost when your father died.
Yes, she was just 11, and
Yeah.
I was 10. And she's turned out to be an absolute marvel. She's a physician at New York Hospital, Cornell, and she has a baby, and she has a husband who's in research at Rockefeller University. And my son Chris is a wizard, a television producer and theater producer.
There's a quote that begins that after Moss, "Time does not bring relief. You all have lied. Who told me time would ease me of my pain?" by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Beautiful quote.
Well, it's true. You know, the normal mourning period is a year, right? That's considered traditional. So by the second year, you feel, now I should feel better, and you don't. And so the disappointment is so terrible that the second year is almost worse than the first year.
Yeah.
The first year, I felt I was like, it was as if I'd had a concussion. I was sort of floating in and out of reality. I didn't really know much about what was going on those months. But the second year was very tough. And the children were still small, looking at me with those big eyes, saying, "Mama, make a life." I'd gone right from my mother's hands to Morse's hands.
Yeah.
I'd never made a decision, a really big one. And so there I was, out there up that well-known creek without a paddle.
Yeah. And yet, you know, you were saying what your mother said about living alone and being able to close the door. I was surprised to read that you had dated Thomas E. Dewey. And I think a lot of people will. But he comes off a very human person.
Oh,
very
he was
sweet.
darling. He was darling. He was sweet, and it was fun going out with him because it was like taking a newborn child around. He had never been to the movies. He'd never been to off-Broadway. He'd been to the opera because he'd come to New York to be a singer. And it was fun to show him the world as it really was, and he loved my friends.
Well, Kitty, speaking of, to tell the truth now, 20 years of doing that, before Moss dies, after, it's a way of, I guess, life and keeping up the showbiz part.
That's right.
But do you still vocalize?
Well, yes, you have to if you're going to be a singer. I do, and it gets harder and harder as you get older. I said the other day, doing those scales is like pushing a stone uphill with my nose.
Yeah. And the part of Prince Orlovsky in De Fledermaus.
Yes.
Now I can see why with the legs.
Well, that was a part I loved doing. I like pants parts, but this one was really first class, and I got great notices on my legs. And Garson Kanin said one day he wanted to see me again in those black tights up to here.
Yeah.
And he put me again in the part in the Metropolitan Opera. I had forgotten about the Met. I had put that dream aside as I went into what I then called my middle years.
Yeah.
I now am going into my middle years.
We all are going into middle years.
I keep pushing mine back. You're not in your middle years yet. Wait till you get as old as I am, then you'll go into your middle years.
And Rudolph Bing, that story of going, and that was in, you know, I've heard friends of mine say they want to write for a series, they've got a great show. And a friend of mine who is a professional and a producer, Lila Garrett, said, you never write a show about that particular series because they know every idea. You write it about something else. And you do that at the Met for Rudolph Bing. You sing operetta, you sing, what was it, Cole Porter?
No, it was Dick Rogers.
Dick
It was
Rogers.
Falling in Love with Love.
Yeah.
I decided to do something I knew how to do, not something that he'd heard better than I could do, like
Yeah.
an aria. So I sang Falling in Love with Love, and when it was over, I thought, I've achieved my ambition. I've sung one song straight through at the Metropolitan Opera, the old one,
Yeah.
the beautiful one, down on Broadway.
Yeah.
And then he said, did you bring something from Die Fledermaus? And I said, oh, Mr. Bing, that faceless man in the 14th row, it's been quite a while since I sang Fledermaus. I didn't tell him how long. So he said, did you bring something else? And I said, yes, Wien, Wien, nur du allein.
Yeah.
And it's a folk song. And I
How
sang
does it go? Do you know a little?
Wien, Wien, nur du allein, soll stets die Stadt meiner Träume sein.
Oh, I hope you are still singing, Kitty. I mean, I hear the voice again, and I must say I could be sitting in that front row.
Well, I do still sing, and I have an accompanist, and he comes a couple of times a week, and we work. I had to drop it a little bit to finish the book.
Well, and
because
also
that took time.
And also, now we wear the fourth hat, which is chairman of the New York State Arts Council.
That's right, and that takes 95%
Yeah.
of my time.
And
very important.
Talk about learning to become a board member
Oh.
and what the responsibilities are as chairman.
Well, you
Or
know,
for my
friends-
feminist friends and for myself, chairperson.
No, I'm the chairman.
Okay.
But my friends have no idea what I do. Once in a while they say to me, darling, explain what you do at the Arts Council. And as I start, the glaze comes over the eyes, the mind is wandering elsewhere, and I don't even pursue the subject because it's very complicated. I've learned to be a good politician. I have to go to Albany to get the budget and talk to the governor, who's been very kind, Governor Cuomo. I have to know all about the administration, the rules and regulations of running a state agency. I came in when the budget was $27 million. It is now nearly 60. I am not salaried, but I'm the CEO of a very important state agency.
And not only is that important as a state, America is judged in the world more by its arts than by any other aspect. And it is the finest part of this country that we really export to the world.
Exactly. And we fund everything that is nonprofit in the state of New York. We have just made a consortium with 6 states, including California, to ask the NEA for a challenge grant for individual artists. And we got $800,000. And Monday I'm giving a big party, cocktail party, at the New York Times because Punch Sulzberger has given me their beautiful room where they entertain VIPs. And I'm getting a bunch of very important CEOs of big corporations to try to interest them in helping us to match our grant.
For that sort of money, when one thinks of the mega, that is floating around, and one reads the cover of Forbes of Fortune, that is a drop in the bucket
But
for
Malcolm
them.
Ford, he's coming.
All right.
We're going to try to nail him.
Okay, because reading this, the arts are really, if you have nothing else in life, to hear an opera singer, to be able to be exposed to good theater, to even reading good literature, that's where a civilization is judged.
Well, you know, there's another thing. Economically, it's so important because New York City lives on tourism. And more tourists come to arts events than go to sports events. And they don't come to New York for the dirt and the potholes and whatever else is around. They come for the arts. So when I go to Albany, I don't talk about the quality of life so much anymore. I talk about dollars and cents and what the arts bring in.
Yeah, bottom line is still, at Camelot, and when you speak of this I'm giving tea and sympathy, but the last songs from Camelot about Once There Was. Well, let's hope, Kitty, with you as chairman of the arts, it will continue. The book is wonderful. It is better than most novels today. And
I'm thrilled. I really am. I'm so
thank
grateful to you.
And really, to tell the truth, you are wonderful. Will you autograph this? And if you would like a copy of our publication, Good Books, write to me, Connie Martinson, P.O. Box 691640, Los Angeles, California, 90069, or look for our column in Beverly Hills Today, Palm Springs Today, all of the California Press Bureau's newspapers. We'll tell you about some other books we've liked recently. Mimi Greenberg's book, Invisible Scars. She is a psychotherapist who did have a mastectomy. This is about how to handle having breast cancer. Fantastic book. Once Upon a Time, Andrew Ritchie's book, really, Major Taylor. In an era when America was bigoted, Major Taylor was one of the great bicycle racers. He was a hero in France. He was a hero in Australia, and he couldn't get a decent meal in America. This is a story of his life and of an era maybe not to be proud of, but what a man who could bike and could race in Paris and in Sydney, Australia. Interesting book. And last but not least, Peter Feebleman's book, Lily. Lily and Hillman Remembered. And if you remember nothing, you'll have to know that Kitty Carlisle met Moss Hart really at a party at Lily and Hillman's late at night when she never thought she wanted to go out alone. But she walks in there with Edna Ferber, and that's the beginning of really the second act of Kitty Carlisle Hart. Peter Feebleman also wrote Charlie Boy, and this is about his romance as a young man in his 30s with Lillian Hellman, and it was a love and a commitment, as he said, that lasted to her dying day. She left him her house in Martha's Vineyard, the royalties of her estate, and he honors them in this book. Meanwhile, support your local library. If you're in Los Angeles, visit our poor burned-down one. If you're in New York, visit the Lions outside the library on 42nd Street. It is a thrill. And an organization called Reading is Fundamental for Children, and we'll see you next week. Kitty, thank you so very much.